All right, welcome to This Explainer. I'm so glad you're here. If you've spent practically any time online, you've definitely heard stories about the dark web. It gets painted as this super shadowy, hidden internet just totally packed with deep secrets, hackers, and criminals lurking in digital alleyways. And, well, while some of those stories might have a tiny grain of truth to them, the reality, most of what people actually believe about the dark web is just completely wrong. So today, we're going to peel back the layers of all these sensationalized stories and look at the hard facts. We're breaking down the tech, the history, and the actual real-world applications of this hidden network. So let's start right at the top with the most fundamental question. What is the dark web really? It's a phrase that gets thrown around so much in headlines and movies, usually just to grab your attention. But when we actually start looking closer, you quickly realize that the whole Hollywood version of this space is just a massive oversimplification. To really get it, we've got to separate the facts from the fiction. The contrast between what we think we know and the objective reality is, frankly, incredibly stark. On one hand, we have the myth, this pervasive idea that the dark web is purely a lawless criminal underworld, built by bad actors for bad actors. But then we look at the actual truth. The dark web is actually built on a complex routing tool that was originally created by the U.S. Navy. Yeah, the U.S. Navy. It's a technology built for secure communication, and today, it's heavily utilized by political dissidents and privacy advocates all around the world. So it's not just a digital black market, it's literally a highly sophisticated piece of internet architecture. Section 1. Beyond the surface web, the layers of the internet. To make sense of how all this fits into our daily lives, we really need to map out exactly where the dark web sits in the broader ecosystem of the internet. It helps to think of the internet kind of like a giant iceberg. Right at the very top, sticking out of the water, we have the surface web. This is everything indexed by search engines like Google, the news sites, public blogs, really any page you can find with a quick search. Now, right below that is the deep web. A lot of people actually confuse the deep web with the dark web, but they are very, very different. The deep web is simply anything behind a login. Your personal email account, your online banking portal, your company's private intranet, that whole shebang is the deep web. It makes up the vast majority of our daily internet use, and it's hidden from Google purely for privacy and security. And then finally, all the way at the very bottom, we have the dark web. This is a very small, highly specific portion of the internet that is intentionally hidden. And that brings us to a precise definition. The dark web is a small, intentionally hidden portion of the internet requiring special software to access. You absolutely cannot get to it using your standard web browser. You can't just type a URL into Chrome or Safari and magically land on a dark web page. No way. It requires specific tools and protocols designed specifically to obscure where a website is hosted and exactly who is visiting it. Section 2. Unpacking the Onion Router. Unpacking Tor. So how exactly does this whole hiding process work? Well, the engine behind most of the dark web is something called Tor, which stands for the Onion Router. And as we briefly touched on a minute ago, the historical origins of Tor are just fascinating. It was originally developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. Their goal was to protect sensitive government communications from being intercepted or traced. The absolutely crucial point to remember here is that Tor's open, anonymous nature wasn't some kind of accident or a glitch. It was a deliberate, intentional design choice by the United States government to make sure messages could be sent securely over a public network. Here is exactly how Tor pulls off that remarkable anonymity. When you use Tor, it takes your internet traffic and puts it through three main steps. First, it heavily encrypts your data. Second, it bounces that encrypted data through multiple volunteer servers located all over the globe, rather than taking a direct, straight-line path from your computer to the website. And third, through this elaborate bouncing process, it completely hides the user's identity. It's called the onion router because your data is literally wrapped in layers of encryption, like the layers of an onion, which are peeled away one by one as the data travels through the network. This brilliantly illustrates the absolute genius of the system. We have a great quote from our sources on this. Each relay only knows the previous and next hop. No single server knows both who you are and where you're going. This compartmentalization is the absolute key to total anonymity. The server receiving your data only knows the server that just handed it over and the server it needs to hand it to next. No single point in the chain has the full picture. It really is a masterclass in secure routing. So how does this translate into practical application? How do you actually navigate this space? Well, first off, dark websites don't use standard addresses like .com or .org. They use special .onion addresses. Second, to even open a .onion link, you absolutely require the specific Tor browser. Now, while Tor is definitely the most famous, it's worth mentioning that our sources note an alternative called I2P, or the Invisible Internet Project. I2P uses a totally different architecture and is much more focused on internal network services, which just goes to show that Tor isn't the only technology out there experimenting with these anonymous frameworks.
But hey, as with literally any technology, it isn't perfect. Let's bring this technical explanation back down to reality for a second. There is a known vulnerability in the Tor network called the exit node. This is the very last relay in the chain that finally connects your traffic to its actual destination on the regular internet. The thing is, the operators of these exit nodes can potentially see the unencrypted traffic as it leaves the secure network. It's a crucial reminder that while the journey itself is heavily protected, the second that data leaves the final shield to reach a standard web server, well, that anonymity can break down.
Section 3. The Paradox of Anonymity. A Moral Crossroad. This brings us to a really fascinating and frankly complex crossroad. The very same shield that protects the vulnerable inevitably protects the illicit. On the legitimate side of things, the dark web is a critically important tool for journalists, whistleblowers, political dissidents, and everyday privacy advocates, especially those living under oppressive regimes. But exactly because it is so incredibly good at hiding identities, we also see the illegal uses: drug marketplaces, the sale of stolen data, and the distribution of hacking tools. The technology itself is completely neutral, it's just a tool, but its applications represent a tension that has no easy resolution. To really ground the legitimate side of this paradox, let's look at a few major real-world examples from our sources. Edward Snowden famously used Tor to communicate securely with journalists when he was leaking classified information. On top of that, massive mainstream organizations like the BBC, the New York Times, and even Facebook actively operate their own .onion sites. Now, why would they do that? Because they want to ensure that people living in heavily censored countries can bypass state firewalls and access the news and social networks safely. It is a completely vital tool for global free speech. Because of this wild mix of uses, a common question naturally comes up. Is the dark web actually illegal? Well, it's important to clarify the legal studies here. In most countries, simply possessing the Tor browser, accessing the network, and visiting the dark web is 100% legal. It is literally just another way to route internet traffic. The illegality comes entirely from the actions you take while you're there. Accessing the network? Totally fine. Buying stolen data on the network? Yeah, that's a crime. Section 4. Inside the real dark web. Fighting cybercrime. Okay, so we've covered the tech and we've covered the legitimate uses. Now, how does the real world actually fight back against the illegal side of the dark web? For a really long time, there was this myth that the dark web was just this untouchable Wild West. But if we look at the timeline, it proves otherwise. Pre-2013, we had the rise of the Silk Road, the first major dark web marketplace. But then in 2013, the FBI successfully shut it down, and its founder was actually sentenced to life in prison. Fast forward to 2017, and an even larger marketplace called Alphabay was completely dismantled by a massively coordinated effort from international law enforcement. What this clearly illustrates is that despite the heavy encryption and despite the complex routing, law enforcement actively, consistently, and successfully monitors and polices this hidden space. The anonymity is strong, for sure, but it is definitely not absolute. We've covered a whole lot of ground today, from the US Navy's original code all the way to global marketplaces and secure news portals. The dark web is really just one layer of an incredibly vast digital ecosystem. The internet is far bigger and way more complex than most people realize. So I'm going to leave you with this question. How much of it do you truly understand? If you want to keep peeling back these layers with us, make sure to hit subscribe. We are going to keep bringing you clear, honest explainers of the parts of the world no one tells you about.